webinar attendees. So happy to have you here. My name is Marisol Morales, and I serve as the Vice President for Network Leadership with Campus Compact. We're so happy to have you as part of our Campus Compact National Webinar Series. And today's topic is racial equity across college and high school. It's about liberation and transformation, not diversity and inclusion. And we have with us our wonderful and talented presenters from Oregon Campus Compact, Mila Buckland, Kaycie López Jones, and Josh Todd. The presenters will be using a Q&A function and chat throughout the webinar. So we're going to ask you to please post questions to the Q&A and then comments to the chat. I'll give you another reminder later on. So I'll be introducing our presenters shortly, but before I begin, I want to just remind folks of the other webinars that we have. We will not have a webinar in October, but we will have one in November. So if you haven't signed up for those, please check out the compact.org website and you can find more information about our upcoming webinars. The other piece is that I want to plug is our Compact Nation podcast. These are it's a bi-weekly podcast series hosted by President of Campus Compact, Andrew Seligson, Emily Shields, who's the Director of Iowa Campus Compact, and myself. So you can check out those podcasts on any of your favorite podcast listening apps. So let me move on now to introductions. So first we have Mila Buckland. She's a first-generation college graduate, second-generation immigrant. She identifies with pronouns she, her, hers, and is a Southeast Asian American. Buckland is the Curriculum and Training Manager at Campus Compact of Oregon. In her role, she supports Campus Compact's racial equity across college and high school REACH efforts. REACH is a Campus Compact strategic initiative to build a statewide coalition and movement for racial justice in higher education across college and high school in Oregon. Her area of expertise is in gender equity and inclusion of Asian Pacific Islander students. Next, we have Kaycie López Jones. She holds a Bachelor's of Arts in Environmental Analysis, Human Behavior from Pomona College in Claremont, California, and a Master's of Arts in International Development and Service with a foci in intercultural communication and intercultural education. López Jones identifies as an Afro-Chicana indigenous femme, and she uses she, her, hers, ella, or they, them pronouns. Prior to her employment with Campus Compact of Oregon, López Jones worked for the City of Portland's Bureau of Development Services and helped launch the citywide Racial Equity Roadmap Initiative, which aims to foster greater racial equity through training of employees and updating policies and procedures throughout all departments of the City of Portland. López Jones currently serves as the Educational Equity Program Manager for Campus Compact of Oregon, adjunct faculty at Maryhurst University, a qualified administrator for intercultural development inventory, and a tap dance teacher with Dance with Joy Studios in Southwest Portland. And finally, we have Josh Todd, who's the Campus Compact of Oregon's Executive Director and an adjunct professor at Portland State University, as well as a qualified administrator for intercultural development inventory. Todd worked with government for 13 years as a youth organizer and policy advisor for the City and County of San Francisco at Multnomah County, Oregon. Todd brought his experience training on issues of racial justice and equity to Campus Compact 5 years ago to help improve institutional practices, policies, and ways of being that support equity. He has conducted staff trainings, faculty development, executive coaching for college and university presidents, and presented at state and national conferences on issues related to equity in higher education. Todd identifies as a white queer man and uses he, him, his pronouns. Welcome to our wonderful presenters, and so happy that they are part of our network. Again, I just want to remind folks that the presenters will be using the Q&A function that you can find in the Zoom webinar. And you can post questions there that they'll work on answering, and then the chat functions will be for comments. At this time, I will turn it over to our presenters, and I'm going to share my screen as well.
Great, thank you.
Hey everybody, Compact Nation.
Hi.
So I'm just going to jump in and do a little bit of overview of Campus Compact of Oregon and our state. We always like to start all of our engagements acknowledging the indigenous peoples of the land that we are currently sitting on. So here in our offices in Portland, Oregon, we sit at the confluence of the Columbia and the Willamette Rivers, and indigenous peoples have called this land home for tens of thousands of years. We especially want to acknowledge the Chinookan people who have and continue to be the keepers and holders of this space, including the Multnomah and the Clackamas and many other indigenous tribes who have called this place home and who have dealt with and continue to live with the legacy of violence that made this place Oregon and the United States, but who also are still leaders in our community who are here leading fights for justice, for environmental protection, for racial justice in our community. So we want to acknowledge them and do that as a common practice in all of our engagements to remind ourselves and our partners of all of the movements and people who have allowed us to be here in this space today. This is a little bit about Oregon. This is our state, if you don't know what it looks like. Campus Compact of Oregon is made up of 21 campus institutions. Half of our membership are community colleges, which I think is important to call out. And we also did something unique about 3.5 years ago, in that as we shifted to talk more about racial justice, we knew that the barriers that students of color face, that faculty and staff of color face, all of those barriers start way before college. And we needed, if we were going to do a holistic approach, really needed to expand membership. And so we were the first compact in the country to create an associate membership, which allows for government institutions, nonprofits, K-12 schools to compact. And so we also have 15 associate members, which include everything from the Higher Education Coordinating Commission, which is the state agency that oversees all higher education funding, to individual school districts and culturally specific nonprofits that serve kids and families of color starting as early as prenatal. So we try and build that movement across all of those sectors. So you can see our membership, but just wanted to give you a little bit of context of who we are, and then I'm going to throw it over to Mila, who's going to give you the framing of what we're planning on doing today, and take it away.
Yeah. So when we first got together and we're talking about the best sort of use of this 1 hour to tackle a really big topic that has so much nuance and complexity and history of, trying to advance equity and belonging for students of color and all marginalized peoples within educational institutions, we wanted, I think, right away to say that we couldn't do that in one sitting. We couldn't answer maybe all questions that are brought up, or we don't also have all the answers to the questions that we continue to hold in this work. So that I just remember us meeting and saying, okay, we need to get that out. And we need to say that this is a long process, that the pathway to liberation and transformation for our educational institutions and for all our institutions to really holistically serve all students of color, all people of color, and again, all marginalized, historically marginalized peoples, it's a long fight to fight and a hard fight to fight, and we just can't do it in this one hour. But what we decided to do is to share some of our prominent reflections, stories of our partners, or stories of the work that we know is happening in Oregon and across the nation, and provide some questions for us to all sit with, questions that move us in the work, questions that have been raised to us by our partners, by our network. And so that's how we're going to construct this time with you, is to share some stories of our experience. On the slideshow that Marisol just put up are some questions for you to think about as we share these stories. And then, like she shared before, we will be saving some time at the end of every snippet of a story to hear and answer questions that come up through the chat box. We can't get to all of them, but we'll pick a couple, we'll talk about them, and then hopefully we'll have some more time at the end. But that's sort of how we decided to approach this topic today, what we wanted to offer you, and what we have, to do today. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about is a somewhat newer framework that we've really been employing in our office, or really using more and more, because I think that it has allowed us to think about what it means to work for liberation versus equity and inclusion, or versus just equity and diversity and inclusion. and it's a framework of belonging. And I think that in my personal reflection, when we've asked the questions or asked institutions or asked people to reflect on belonging, what it has allowed the people to do is really see themselves in the work, really, and that's something that I think we have really been sitting with, is how to personalize this work for people, because we have seen time and time again that no effort to advance equity is complete or is able to happen if people don't see themselves tied to the efforts, right, or tied to the work, seeing themselves liberated through the liberation of others. So what I mean by a belonging framework is we've started to ask people to really reflect on their own experience within institutions, educational institutions, and to ask themselves when and how have they felt belonging within their institution. And this most recently came up in a request that Josh and I got to help a newly formed diversity, equity, and inclusion committee sort of get started. It was something that had been done by different folks within the institution, but they wanted to formalize a council, a committee to help advance some of their diversity and inclusion efforts on campus. And this committee asked us to help lead this newer team in creating guidelines for their interaction, creating guidelines for the ways that they were going to work together. And so we went and worked with them 2 times. The first time we did that, we tried to share with them resources we use to think about the ways we interact with each other while we do racial equity work together. And I remember us sitting with how quiet folks were within that space, how new the folks felt to one another within the space, even though some of them had worked for a really long time within an institution or within that institution. And when we returned to them, we made the conscious effort to ask them to think about how they came to the institution, and to ask that question within caucus spaces where people of color met with me and the white committee members met with Josh. And very specifically in my time with folks at that institution, I realized that I heard a lot of those individuals didn't feel a sense of belonging within their institution and didn't tell or share that with their other team members. And it was just an interesting reflection to have, because it, again, time and time again, is hard to do this work if you don't feel it for yourself, if you do the work because you have to, because no one else will, and you're worn down, or if you're new to the work and you don't ask yourself about your own capacity, and if you don't trust the people that you're assigned to do the work with in this council, and so when that story really made me understand how important it was for people to reflect on belonging for themselves, and for them to share their stories, their definitions, and the conditions they need to experience belonging with the people that they're supposed to be working with, because it's not complete, right? You can't, I think, truly cultivate a space for belonging for, say, your students if you don't feel it for yourself, and if you don't focus on the healing of the staff and the admin within your institution, especially if you're trying, again, to recruit more students of color to your institution or more staff and faculty of color to your institution. And a framework of belonging is also good because I think that people have different relationships to belonging. So when you ask that question, it's not all positive experiences belonging. Sometimes people share that I have never truly felt like I belong. And so there is a breadth of experiences that can be reflected in that question. And also, I think, an ability to understand that you need to do different things or create different conditions for people to holistically feel like they belong. And so that's just a story I wanted to share, a realization that I had with, again, elders or folks who are long embedded within an institution longer than I have been working in higher ed, that don't feel the sense of belonging that they're trying to cultivate. And step one, or at least a big important step to do simultaneously as you try to advance equity efforts, is to, I think, build and foster relationships and foster a sense of belonging for the people that you're tasking to do that work for you.
And we, just so folks are reminded, we have the question and answer option. If questions come up during stories, feel free at any point to share those and we'll be reviewing them. These are also some of our questions. Mila, do you want to share just some of the questions we work with institutions to think through the belonging framework?
Yeah. So some of the questions that we ask, again, we ask folks to think about it first, especially when we're meeting folks for the first time, or especially when we're with a group that is brand new. But we really ask them to reflect on what belonging means to them. When have they experienced belonging, if they have, and what conditions have led to that experience? Oftentimes those answers have been, oh, I have been in a space where someone allowed me to share who I was outside of, how I've been conditioned to think of myself. So instead of just asking me what my race, gender is, they've asked me to share who I was without some of those more instructive things in place. I don't know if that made sense, but it just a space that allowed a person to enter it without having to only center on their social identities is what I mean. And other conditions have been like, oh, if a facilitator looked like me, or if a space, had food that met my needs without me having to say what my needs were in terms of diet, like those are the kind of conditions that I'm speaking to. And then also the kind of spaces to allow people bring their full selves into it is the answers and the answers that I provide sometimes when I'm asked those questions. Other questions that we've asked: how does your institution center and consciously cultivate belonging for its students, faculty, staff, and admin? And how do you know if students, staff, faculty, admin do experience a sense of belonging on your campus? How are you, getting that feedback? How are you consistently asking yourself that question? And how do you know, and how do you work towards cultivating that sense of belonging if they never tell you that they don't feel it? I think that's something that we've been talking about too. Do you have to have people tell you they don't feel like they belong before you consciously and consistently ask yourself how to do that better? Yeah. Cool.
Next slide, Marisol.
Yeah. So I think that's a very interesting question that leads really well, I think, into this next piece around student voice. Because if you look at the history of student presence on campus, it's quite evident that there's been a strong sentiment of not feeling that sense of belonging. And so at this point, we really shouldn't have to ask. Mm-hmm. There is plenty of evidence right now today that is pointing to this sense of students really not feeling a sense of belonging. So I always say that youth are really the visceral response of our society, and that they really tell us right away if something needs to be addressed. And I remember myself coming into this piece of my identity around 13 and 14, growing up in Seattle, and there being the WTO riots, and me really being interested in that. And then when the Iraq War started, I remember skipping school with some of my peers to go and protest it. And when it continued and I graduated from college, during our graduation, we had banners that we raised during the national anthem, because that was a glorification of Americanness when this whole issue with Iraq was still happening, and we really didn't quite get why, and we actually had our teachers applaud us, which we thought was really important with respect to the accountability of the materials that they were teaching us, which was really to inspire us to be critical thinkers. So really, universities and colleges and any institution of education should be excited when students raise up and offer their voice. I have a history that I'd love to share with you just briefly that sort of speak to this movement of students across the globe to share their voice. Interestingly enough, I started in 1959 in Cuba. Students were led by Fidel Castro to overthrow the Batista dictatorship. In 1960, the Greenboro Four, Azelle Blair, Franklin McClare, Joseph McNeil, and David Richards, 17 through 19 years old, they sat in, and 3 days later, 300 more students were joining them. A few days later, 50 cities were experiencing sit-ins, which quickly led to desegregation of many spaces, and further into the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was the desegregation of public spaces. Right, and so then we've got in the 1960s, we've got the Black student unions and Meches, Chicano student unions collaborating to occupy administrating office, demanding more representation, demanding Black and Chicano departments of education. A lot of this led to the development of the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Commission. So students actually taking on political, sort of identity in order to create some movement, specifically with respect to the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War protests. They partnered with newly collaborated Students for Democratic Society, SDS, mostly white college students, but they still collaborated on issues of poverty, racial equity, and protesting wars, right? 1968, you've got a whole slew of university uprisings that sort of percolate all over the world, really being kicked off at Howard University, which has always been very active with student voice. Around 1,000 students sitting in the administrative offices and in their dormitories to protest the president, protest the lack of representation of their African American culture and their studies, and other instances as well. 1960s through the 70s, of course, folks know about the Vietnam protests that were largely led by student voices across campuses, to protest the war itself, as well as Agent Orange and other organizations that were benefiting from that war. We also have the United Farm Workers, started by Cesar Chavez, or led by Cesar Chavez, I should say, that really was supported by students all across the nation. In the 70s and 80s also saw the divestment of major universities, endowments and financial investments divested from the apartheid in South Africa. 1976, a couple thousand students protested peacefully and were met with gun violence, etc. In South Africa, because they were being asked to adopt the language of Afrikaans and to basically eradicate their own native languages. And so this movement really led to the movement of anti-apartheid, which was joined in the United States by students across campuses, setting up shanty towns and protesting the apartheid movement, which also led to, again, the divestment of universities in that movement. In 1989, we saw Tiananmen Square in China, which was largely led by students, but unfortunately in this case, the state showed its power by really squashing that movement, and ever since, that has been a struggle for a lot of folks with respect to any sort of democratic system for the people of China being able to have voice in their political representation. In 1999, we had the WTO riots. Like I said, I was just now coming of my own sort of awareness in this larger movement of social justice, which is really what I also want to point really feels like the theme throughout most of these student movements. They really are about social justice and pointing to this idea of power shared versus power over, and really asking administrators to be responsible and faculty to take accountability and to share the power, because the students are asking, to really be the protagonists in their life, and to also for us to address these very unjust issues. Currently, we have the Black Lives Matter movement, which of course is not a new movement. It's really a resurgence of civil rights movement that has been going for quite some time, even before the official civil rights movement, right? And I was reading an article, which I actually provided for all you guys, you folks, that pointed to the Parkland shooting and the students who became very involved after the Parkland shooting, and the praise that they were receiving, and which is really great, that they were their students were able to get involved in such a political way. And there was chatter that why doesn't this happen more? And really I was like, really, because there's a long evidence of folks rising up and youth specifically putting their voice out there for us to hear. But there is something different about the demographics of the student at Parkland that made it so that they were highlighted in the media versus most Black Lives Matter students and protesters who are often seen as troublemakers, labeled as troublemakers by the media. And so many of the movements that have been flurrying across campuses in the last year, which we've seen, have been very much motivated by racial justice and a call for a racial equity. And we have, like I said, Black Lives Matter. Evergreen University was just recently in the news, albeit the representation of the news is always biased, so we do have to be critical there. But those students rose up and demanded, made some demands around curriculum and how curriculum is taught, really critiquing the difference, I guess you could say, between free speech and hate speech. Are they the same? Are they different? When an instructor is, being neutral on issues that have historically been very harmful to people, how is that free speech, right? And so really being critical about these questions. And then the University of Vermont actually put out a list of demands to be in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, including basically putting funding where the mouth is, providing funding for multicultural centers, for training for faculty and staff, and specifically for training for police, including the implementation, which I think is great, of a Black Lives Matter flag in the police department at the university. And then Howard University also recently made a list of demands that also speak to, again, access to education, access to housing, access to health, and safety and justice. And so from these movements, I just want to pull out a few themes. I already mentioned the major themes really seem to be social justice, civil rights, and really revolving around the idea of power and how power is utilized. Is it power over, which institutions have historically been very good at following that path, or is it power shared, which is the question that students are raising. They'd like to see accountability for those in power. That's an ask for you to share your power, right? Transparency, same thing, that's a power shared. Access to quality healthcare, mental health practitioners and that are informed and culturally aware and culturally competent, who speak multiple languages, right? Who come from various cultures and are able to, and various life experiences that are reflective of the youth that are actually at the school. Education with respect to tuition, finances, putting the money where the mouth is. If tuition prices are rising, how are the students seeing that? They've also noted that administrative salaries seem to be rising in tandem. So that is not going to be going unnoticed, right? Students are paying for an education that they expect to be seen in and represented in. And so centering the student voice and the student experience is going to be a primary step in creating that sense of belonging for every student at one's campus. Decision-making abilities, whether that is also another power shared endeavor, specifically power shared between students, faculty, and staff with respect to grievance processes, considering the justice sort of system at a school, who's on that committee, how are complaints around racist or sexist, homophobic, etc. comments handled by your university and by that system. Physical health and wellness, as I mentioned, a lot of students are asking for the curriculum to be rehauled and for it to be reflective of the cultures that are being represented at the school. So there's another ask for community responsibility, and that really also is looking at how power is being shared with the community at large, because the students themselves come from those communities and would like for them to see those communities as well thrive when they go back, as well as a democratic process. So in a nutshell, there's been student voice on campuses for a very, very long time. They have been very vocal. There are very consistent themes throughout the decades that really revolve around this idea of belonging and sharing power in ways that really center those who are most marginalized and systematically sort of minoritized.
I think the student piece too also ties directly to the title of this workshop, because I think where our administrators, where faculty and staff are, in some ways is behind where students are. We have administrations that we work with, institutions pushing for more inclusion, more diversity, where students are in many ways asking for a complete reimagining of the academy. They're saying, how do we function in relationship to this institution? How do we transform the way in which higher education exists? And I think that's a very different question. Speaking of questions, we had a couple come in, so I'm just going to pose them and see what you two think. This is going back to the belonging framework, so we'll answer these while people, if you have any questions about the student framework. But someone had a question that said, how do you lead into the conversation of belonging with people or a group who are new to each other without making people feel too vulnerable?
Absolutely. I think that in the past we have constructed an activity where, especially if it's the first time we're meeting with someone, we share the ask of having them bring in a representation of belonging, so that it's not quite clear in the sort of sharing of these representations who it is that brought it, and then also it's not required that people share what they brought, or that people ask people why they brought it. So I remember Josh and we did a round of sort of events around Oregon to introduce ourselves and introduce the way we wanted to collaborate with more institutions around Oregon. And that was one of the first things that we did with them, or one of the first asks we made of them, is to sit with that question of belonging, bring in this visual or this way for people to engage with your understanding, but we didn't necessitate them having to share what they brought, or allowing necessarily like conversation to happen about what they brought, because we recognize sometimes you will never know, right? I think that was the power of that activity, is that, and that's what we said, is like, here is everything being presented to you, but sometimes people will never tell you what they need. So how do you sit with something in front of you and make the best decision, or hold your interpretation of it, and then think about your own like that was something that we constructed, and that would be a suggestion that I ask, is you pose the question, you say why you want to center on belonging. And again, the reason why we do is because it brings to light so much of what people need around a common framework, but also enables people to talk about times in which they didn't experience belonging, or their different relationships to belonging.
Yeah, I mean, when it sounds like having structured, formal, and informal spaces that are meant for relationship building is really the way to do that, whether that is part of the orientation, where the first couple of days are basically just we're getting to know each other, including, going out to having a picnic, happy hour, what have you. That stuff, those are practices we have. Also ongoing meetings, so, continuing the relationship into other facets, whether that means taking a check-in outside of the office and just walking around. Yesterday, Josh and I just decided to walk out around and by the waterfront just to get some exercise and have a new setting, and we just related to each other. It was really nice before talking shop, so to speak. So simple things like that can really add, but it takes time too. So if people are vulnerable, part of that acceptance and a belonging is being respectful of that vulnerability and allowing for there to be time.
There's one other question, which I think anybody doing liberation work, equity work on institutions is probably experiencing. It says, how do you respond to folks who may share they don't feel they belong, who are part of dominant groups, such as white folks, men, etc., because we're having more conversations on racial justice or equity? They're starting to feel like the minority because more and more POCs or marginalized groups are talking about issues that make them feel uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think resistance, I'm going to speak as the white guy. I think resistance is coming up. I think we always see any group that's in power, when they feel that that power is threatened, become anxious, can become violent, can become uncomfortable in many different ways. And I think there's some just acknowledging that that's going to be the case. Our country has changed. Our country is continuing to change. White people will not be the majority. Now, that doesn't mean that they, if we don't make changes, won't continue to hold the dominant power within institutions, and then that causes harm. Some things that we do to address this is, one, we use racial affinity groups a lot. For folks who have not ever really had to think about or talk about their own racialized identity, or maybe don't even recognize that they have a racial identity, right? White has been invisible for many. It's just seen as normal. It's seen as the, you know, this is what I just expect. If I grew up white, that talking about being white is in and of itself really uncomfortable. And so for folks who that is the case, they need safer, smaller spaces sometimes to be able to work through that. So we do a lot of racial affinity groups. We do a lot of, in our training, sometimes we will do other engagements that have them, you know, we do meditation, we do mindfulness, so that you get better at seeing your own reactions. We engage with art because it shifts the ways in which we think and experience the world. So it takes us maybe out of our head and into our hearts, where we can better connect with people across difference. So there's lots of different tools that we've used, but I think recognizing that that resistance and that pushback is real, and we should be planning for it, because if it's not there, that's the thing to be surprised by, not that it is there.
And if there is an expression of that, like Josh says, it does mean it needs to be processed. And folks who are in a dominant culture or have a lot of power aren't used to processing that type of discomfort in their everyday life, because they're so rarely confronted with it. So now that is being confronted more, it means that there does need to be spaces created for folks who are experiencing that to process that, because that does play into a sense of holistic belonging in the end.
Yeah, and just to piggyback and reiterate some of the things they just mentioned, planning for it and cultivating space to process it, that's something that we as a team in a lot of our engagements, when we are, working with mixed groups, right, with people of different levels or different experiences working in racial equity, that is something that we ask ourselves, our colleagues, of who is able to meet this need at this time, who is not. You know, it's not a thing we don't take a lot of time and care in asking each other. Are you able to meet this person where they're at today? Are you able to meet this white person's sort of newer processing journey in this structure? And if not, who is? And then how can we support you in doing that? You know, we definitely plan as many spaces as we can to allow people of different levels to engage in some things. And then we also plan what we are sure and firm we need to say, what lens we won't ever let falter, or beliefs we won't ever let falter, and then ask each other, okay, who can meet and show compassion or give time to a person who is, again, just exploring maybe something new or feeling experiences being left out when in their life or because of their positionality they have not historically. So that is just something that we've done for sure.
Tavita had a really quick question too. She said that going to be planning to use Surge, which is showing up for racial justice in Virginia, and did we have any other groups that can help with white affinity group work? And actually, there is a great curriculum called Transforming White Privilege. It was created by the World Trust and Shakti Butler. They have, it can either be done as 2 full days or 4 half days curriculum for white folks, created by a collective of women of color. And I believe they have, I think it's actually a multiracial group, but they're right now doing a series of train the trainers around the country. So you can also look up World Trust transforming white privilege. And there are trainings happening all over the country right now to train people on how to use that curriculum. So that's just a real quick resource.
There's also a book that just came out recently by Ruth King, and it's entitled Mindful of Race, Transforming Racism from the Inside Out. And it's basically a guide for affinity groups, mostly for white folks. And so that's something I would highly suggest. There's questions that even are asked when certain behaviors arise or certain sentiments, etc.
So we're going to transition into one of the other themes. We have two themes left. We wanted to center first on belonging and then on students, because that's why we're all here, but then also wanted to address faculty and staff and how that work shows up for faculty and staff around liberation work. And so I've got two quick stories to show kind of different ways of approaching this. So we work with an institution which I can name because I have permission, but Warner Pacific University. It's the only Hispanic serving institution, 4-year institution in our state. And they had made a commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion broadly, and were hiring and continually finding that they just weren't getting diverse pools, or they would have a diverse pool, but it seemed like more frequently than not, the white candidate was the candidate who ultimately got selected. And it was a struggle for them because their student diversity has increased significantly. They went from 6 years ago having a student body that was about 11% students of color. They now have a student body 6 years later that's 65% students of color. And they were really wanting their faculty and staff to reflect that diversity. And what ended up happening was their president said, I am taking every hiring process under my authority. They don't have unions. I should say that. And she vetted every hiring pool and said, if this isn't a diverse pool, then this is a failed search and we need to restart. We need to be building relationships in communities of color. We need to be going after professional associations, letting folks know, talking about our values. And they started seeing significant change when at the executive leadership level, the president was saying, no, this is a key, critical, mission critical strategy for us. Now, I think that story is powerful, but I also recognize that for many of us, having a president take that level of leadership is probably rare. And so I wanted to share a companion story, which is also kind of the other way that this happens, right? Top down, bottom up. In Washington, there's a group called the Diversity and Equity in Hiring and Professional Development, DEHPD group. And it's a collective of professionals from Washington State community and technical colleges, founded and led by Vic Ball. And what they did was, as employees of community colleges and technical colleges in Washington, they created a manual, a resource guide for their state, but really for the entire country, that looked at 17 different steps in the hiring process, critical questions that you can ask all along the way, and walked people through what should you be thinking about asking. And actually, Marisol, if you want to switch to the next slide, to ensure that every step of your hiring process, you're considering equity, really, again, transforming the ways in which institutions were doing hiring, asking not just like who applies and who is selected, but who never applies, looking at your hiring pool and what communities are not coming forward with even applications and why is that, and critiquing their own processes. They also talk a lot about healing. We recruit and bring folks of color to campuses, and then those experiences can be damaging. They can be painful. They can be exhausting. And are you looking at the cultivating spaces of healing for faculty who then are recruited so they retain? So I just it's going to be in the resources, but wanted everyone to know that there is this national resource out there. And also to show you that sometimes you need these different strategies, both top down and bottom up.
Mm-hmm.
Let me check in. Could someone post the name of the org that Josh is talking about? I will post it right now. We can go to the next story.
Okay, and so another thing that we wanted to talk about was that has already been alluded to is just how much time it can take to really see these efforts succeed in any way. And like we said, it's a process and it does take time. That said, it can take a shorter amount of time than you may think, as short as 5 years, as long as however long it takes. But I know Warner has, transformed in around 5 years, honestly. And then the story I want to bring is I actually run a statewide critical mentorship program. And one of those programs is at Chemeketa Community College in Woodburn, which is like 92% Latinx community in the schools. And so the institution there also is largely Latinx community. And so they have a program in which they've really invested in their local community. One of my members last year who ended up serving at Woodburn, he actually was in their program as a student, right? And then he ended up going through Chemeketa and doing some classes and becoming interested in becoming a coach. And so what the program does is AmeriCorps members are placed at various sites to recruit and train college students and community members to be coaches for low-income youth, first generation, and youth of color, and to provide a more critical lens to that coaching. And so Alvaro was actually a coach. He became a coach. After serving as a coach, he became a member. And then after serving as a member and having had some difficulty in his past education, he really gained the confidence and sort of strength to go back to school, and is now going to get his master's in education so that he can come back and teach in that community. Mm-hmm. So that is definitely a committed long-term commitment that literally provides a pathway for folks in the community to kind of come up and be provided education, be provided work and compensation and actual professional experience, and then even promote education to be, to come back and serve in that community. He's already been told, that there's a potential position waiting for him. And so it's really exciting to see this actually function when there is a committed intention to create that pathway for community members.
That story too, I think, is really powerful in that, I think at the time that program started, while 90% of the students were Latinx, about 90% of the faculty or staff at K-12 schools were white. Right. And it's been amazing to see these two institutions, Chemeketa at the 2-year, Pacific University at the 4-year, come together and partner with their K-12 school districts and continue investing year after year after year, even though I think they just now graduated their first Pacific University folks who could actually be hired as teachers. Right. And I think so often we think of this work as, or not we, but folks think of this work as like an initiative or a task force or something that we're going to put in the 3-year strategic plan. And we need to recognize that true equity requires a lifelong commitment to continual growth, because as you start asking these questions, you will uncover other barriers for other groups because you've gotten so much better at critiquing your institution. And so the work never stops. Doing the work just gives you deeper ways of creating more equity, more belonging for everyone at the institution. So I just love that story as a commitment over the long term to address an issue.
Yeah, and that institution has also offered positions to other folk. They've other students who were students in the program have become coaches. So that is an ongoing mission for them.
Do you all have any final reflections or thoughts from our 4 stories?
I actually do have one. I forgot to mention, and I also think is related to sort of overall, and it really has to do with the idea of sort of security and campus security. One thing, another theme for all of these, student voice movements is that many of them were shut down by police officers who were armed. And so I do think it is important for folks to ask the question of what does it mean to have armed security on campus when so often, student voice is what is, embodies and safety don't actually align up with their presence there. So I do think thinking critically about how the physical space is set up at institutions and the people who also comprise that space, who that centers at the institution.
Any final thoughts, Mila?
I don't think so.
Questions? Any other questions that folks want to share? I guess my one and final thought as people are typing in questions. I think it is much harder to frame this work around transformation and liberation than it is diversity and inclusion. It is, for me, much more complicated to sit and try and have conversations with presidents or faculty or staff when we start from a place of recognizing that higher education as it was created in this country was not meant to serve the students that we serve now. The structure itself elevates whiteness, centers specific ways of knowing and being. And if we're not willing to look at that, we're always going to be doing transactional approaches to change instead of transformational approaches. And I think transformation is going to get us to a place of true liberation, belonging, and wholeness. But it's also incredibly daunting and scary, and I think requires a significant investment of time and energy and personal work. And that would be the last thing that I would say is just how much of this is work that has to happen at multiple levels. We have to be thinking about the systemic impacts of armed police and what that says to students who have generational trauma around violence from police. We have to think about institutional barriers, but then we also have to think about what does this mean for me and where do my reactions come from and how do I witness my own thinking before it causes me to react on someone. And that's a really, it's a huge process. It's a lifelong commitment. And it goes beyond the scope of one director of diversity in one office of multicultural affairs in one small portion of our institutions. And so that's just, maybe not an uplifting call, but just an honest one that this work is really difficult long-term, but has the ability for us to transform institutions in ways that really unlock potential and hope and
I do have one more thing to say. Okay, that was so I was one again who brought forth our framework of belonging, how we use it. I want to name a critique that we also hold about the framework of belonging, in that sometimes to belong, people have had to give up what makes them different. And when we talk about belonging, it is a centering on difference and creating a space that enables difference, not
Hello,
and we're back, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So belonging is not sameness is what I was is what I was saying. And sometimes again, people's relationships to belonging has been the necessity to give up what makes them different. And what we're talking about is belonging as an invitation to understand and unpack what makes people and allows people to be whole.
I think when we get into the work, we start to reflect. My ask is that we start to reflect on what is the difficult part of it. Why is the work difficult? And that is a very personal question. That is something that when it gets down to it, we have to see ourselves as the system, as part of the system, as creating and inventing the system. And how do we need to sort of heal ourselves that's where the discomfort is. And so once we realize that that discomfort is relieved when we actually reflect and we actually do the work, it's like popping a pimple, I like to say. You just get it out, it's really painful, but then you're able to clean it up. And once you get past that first barrier, often we'll notice that all the other barriers are barriers we put in place to protect our own self from having to do the work.
So here are some resources that we've provided. We'll also add the ones that we named because of some of your questions. We'll send that to Marisol and folks so that that can get out to you all.
Marisol, when we got kicked off, we lost the QA function. Are there any questions and answers that have shown up that you think would be good to address?
No other questions have come up.
Okay, great. Thank you all for listening to us today, for your questions.
Yeah, thank you all.
And thanks to Campus Compact and the Mission Achieving Committee for creating the webinar series. This is great.
Awesome. So
back to you.
Thanks. So Mila, Kaycie, and Josh, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and experience with this topic of the webinar. It's, I think, really relevant considering kind of what the state of our nation is, and definitely relevant to the work that we want to continue to move forward with Campus Compact, and thinking about how do we do this work with the equity framework, how do we make sure that we're engaging all students and taking into consideration sort of the varied experiences that we need to bring together through this, and the really both relationship work that this is, but also the personal deep development work that we need to do. I often talk about it as sort of the micro and macro, and that we have to constantly shift between the two. So it was a very engaging webinar and meaningful for these times. Thank you for all of the attendees who came on and who are with us till the end. You'll be receiving an email shortly with both the resources as well as an evaluation. So we welcome your feedback. We're always looking to engage in continuous improvement, and so hearing from you allows us to do that. In addition, we'll have a YouTube channel available with the recording, so if you want to share this with others, it will be available, or if you want to refer back to it in the resources. You can also find the information in the past webinars on our website, compact.org. Lastly, I want to also put a plug in for the Western Region Conference, Continuums of Service, that will be taking place March 6th through 8th, 2019. Again, March 6th through 8th. And it'll be taking place in San Diego, beautiful San Diego. And the theme, especially if you logged on to this webinar, will be Beyond Borders, Embracing Multiple Ways of Knowing and Being. So a lot of the sort of aspects of the work that were spoken about today in the webinar will be included in the conference. And you can go to continuumsofservice.org for more information. I believe the call for proposals has just closed, but there is still time to register for the conference and being a part of it. Until next time, thank you all for attending. Be well.